One of the strange side effects of studying psychology is this. When your heart breaks, you don't just feel the pain, you start studying it like a case study. Because while everyone else is trying to survive the breakup, you find yourself asking questions like, why does my brain keep replaying the same memories? Why does losing someone feel like I'm quitting a drug? And why does moving on is only possible if I completely reinvent the structure of my mind? Moving on from someone you love is not just emotional, it's neurological, it's cognitive, and sometimes it's biological, which raises a fascinating question. How does a psychology grad move on from a relationship? It's not simple, but never think it's just a feeling. Because when you think of love, it's not just a simple feeling, it's also the chemical happening in your brain. To answer that question, we need to look at heartbreak through three layers of psychology: biological, cognitive, the identity. Let's begin with the biological one. The first insight psychology offers about heartbreak is biological, because when attachment forms, the brain does not treat love like a simple emotion. It treats it like a reward system. Romantic attachment activates dopamine pathways associated with motivation and craving. Brain imaging research by Helen Fisher found that when people look at the photos of someone they recently broke up with, the ventral tegmental area of the brain becomes highly active, the same region involved in reward and addiction, which means something very important. When a relationship ends, the brain does not simply register sadness. It reacts as if a reward it depended on has suddenly disappeared. Dopamine levels shift, oxytocin drops, cortisol rises, and suddenly, what we call moving on starts to feel less like an emotional decision, but more like a withdrawal, like quitting a drug. So here's what's happening when you can't stop thinking about your ex. Moving on from someone isn't always just emotional. Sometimes it's neurological withdrawal. Think of the person you're trying to move on from, like a drug. When someone quits a drug, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, the brain doesn't just erase the substance overnight. It goes through withdrawal. It craves what used to give it relief, happiness, euphoria. And something very similar can happen with relationships. Because when we attach to someone, our brain begins treating the relationship like a reward system. So when the relationship ends, the brain doesn't simply register sadness. It reacts to the sudden disappearance of something it had learned to depend on, which is why moving on sometimes doesn't feel like healing. It feels like you're drowning yourself before you could finally breathe. And this leads to one of the more unsettling realizations about heartbreak. You're not just grieving a person, you're grieving the chemical stability your brain associated with them. But the biology of attachment is only part of the story. Even after chemical intensity fades, something else keeps the mind returning to the relationship. And this brings us to the second layer of psychology, the cognitive layer. Why the mind keeps returning. One of the most fascinating ideas in cognitive psychology is something called the Zeigarnik Effect. The Zeigarnik Effect describes the brain's tendency to remember unfinished tasks more vividly than completed ones. In simple terms, the mind struggles to tolerate incomplete stories, which explains something many people experience after a breakup. The brain keeps replaying conversations, revisiting memories, reconstructing events, trying to understand what happened. Not necessarily because the relationship was perfect, but because the brain is trying to resolve an unfinished narrative. Our brain actually struggles to move on without closure. It has a hard time tolerating unfinished stories. When something ends without explanation, the mind keeps going back to it, trying to figure out what happened, replaying conversations, reanalyzing moments, reconstructing the past. The brain hates open loops, plot holes. This is our tendency to remember unfinished experiences more vividly than completed ones. Think about how often your mind goes back to the last conversation you had with them, the message they never replied to, the argument that never fully ended, the question you never got to ask. Your brain keeps replaying those moments because it's still trying to finish the story, which is why some of the hardest relationships to move on from are not the ones that ended clearly. They're the ones that ended without a clear ending. And sometimes what people call closure is simply the moment when the brain stops trying to solve the story. Attachment and emotional safety. One of the most influential discoveries in psychology came from Harry Harlow's attachment experiments. Harlow studied infant monkeys raised with two artificial caregivers. One caregiver was made of wire and provided food. The other was covered in soft cloth, but provided no nourishment. What the experiment revealed was remarkable. The monkeys preferred the cloth mother, not because it fed them, but because it provided comfort and emotional security. But attachment alone still doesn't explain why breakups feel so disorienting. There is another psychological process happening at the same time, and that process has to do with our identity. Identity loss after breakups. Psychologists describe this process through something called self expansion theory. It proposes that when people enter close relationships, their sense of self expands to include the other person. When you fall in love, you literally incorporate their hobbies, their jokes, their social circle, and even their personality traits into your sense of who am I? Experiences become shared, routines become shared, future plans become shared, which leads to something unexpected. When the relationship ends, you just don't lose a partner. You lose the version of yourself that existed with them. Self expansion is very important when you love someone. This is a process of accommodating your partner's identity. You shared a life, you shared a nervous system, you gave them half of your pieces, and you took half of theirs to build a new picture of what your world looks like. But when they leave, you broke up, they take their pieces back without giving yours back. So you're not just grieving a person, you're also grieving a personality. You look in the mirror and see a stranger because the person who used to reflect you back is gone. It's a force factory reset on your identity, and the system is crashing because you aren't just missing them, you're standing in an empty space looking for the person who used to be there with you. Sometimes we think we miss someone because we love them deeply, but what we actually miss isn't a person, it's the habit. Because it's not just about having a broken heart, but also having a broken habit. See, when you're with someone for a long time, you adapt to almost everything about them, from their routine, to their jokes, playlists, faves, to their dreams. Your nervous system actually familiarize them. You two become a universe on a perfect rotation. Their presence affects your brain like the cortisol and the release of oxytocin. So when they leave, you aren't just missing a person, you are experiencing autonomic dysregulation. Your brain does not rotate the same way anymore. Your brain isn't grieving love alone, it's panicking because its primary external stabilizer is gone. You don't miss them, you miss the version of yourself that felt safe when they were in the room. So far, we've explored why heartbreak is difficult: the biological layer, the cognitive layer, the identity layer. But once someone understands these mechanisms, another questions appear. How do you actually move forward? So here's the psych grad strategy for moving on. If you want to move on from someone, you have to start building a routine that does not include them anymore. First, you have to master stimulus control. Your brain is a machine built on triggers. If you keep the ghost of the relationship in your visual field, the photos, the gifts, the digital footprints, you are keeping the wound open. You have to starve the habit to kill the craving. Second, you have to break the nostalgia loop. The very reason why you can't move on is you're addicted to nostalgia. Delete your shared playlists, throw their perfumes, and hide their pictures. Your brain is not to be trusted sometimes. It will always choose ways to remember the person, especially if you have been keeping reminders from them. Finally, you must expand. You feel small because your world just shrunk. It's okay if you are stuck with them, but keep your options open. Stop depending your survival on how this person will respond to you. Relationships with intermittent reinforcements are the hardest to be with because it was not a boring relationship, but it wasn't also stable. Some days they will treat you right, some days they will be the most toxic person in the world. Their unpredictable presence create the strongest psychological attachment. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. When love is sometimes warm and sometimes distant, the brain keeps hoping the reward will return. And that hope you have for people who are inconsistent will burn you out. It will drain the hell out of you because you can't sleep at night. But remember, to be treated nice once does not make up for the plenty of times they have taken you for granted. But here's what I realized about healing, and it's about the fact of neuroplasticity. Your brain is literally meant to change. It is designed to rewire itself. Even after it spent years of getting used to the presence of one specific person, it's shedding old connections to make room for a person of you that doesn't need to feel complete. In a lab, we call this neuroplasticity. We talk about synaptic pruning and neural pathways. But for you, in this messy 3 a.m. reality of your bedroom, we simply call it healing.